David, good to see you.
Good to see you too. You're the Petrozewski and I'm the Pensoff. And what is this?
This is Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast, and some people have noted that they don't like the screw ups because it comes across as unprofessional. For whatever
Hmm.
reason, people who listen on Spotify are saying that. What do you think about that?
Hmm. That's a fair point. Why don't we just cut right to it then and say it's actual evolutionary psychology by actual evolutionary psychologists and point taken. Enjoy.
David, today we have a wonderful guest, Karen Kramer, who is at the University of Utah, and she does incredible work on following actual foragers and finding out how people are spending their time doing follows of people, and then also figuring out sort of who's doing what. And I think one of the most interesting things about this is that it turns out that like kids especially are actually contributing quite a bit and doing quite a bit of the work of sort of parenting and co-parenting.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a really fascinating episode that shed a lot of light into how work gets done in a small scale society, how field work gets done. She is a veteran in the field of evolutionary anthropology research, giving us some really fascinating stories into what life is like in a small scale community. So this was a really fun episode.
Yeah, and just sort of the idea that how intergenerational, how having multiple generations in the same area, in the same location, is really foundational to human nature. And that maybe if we're living in these very age stratified places, like colleges or like schools, it might be very unnatural for us and might have weird consequences. And I think that's a really important thing that I'm still thinking about from this episode.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. So without further ado, enjoy Karen Kramer.
All right. So today we're extremely excited to have Karen Kramer, who is professor of anthropology at University of Utah, here with us. Um, Karen, I know that you've been giving talks recently about the evolution of human life history and cooperation specifically between parents and children. And we've had some human behavioral ecologists on or evolutionary anthropologists on talking about human life history. We just had Mike Gervin on. And I think your work is super interesting in the following context of one thing we've talked about is sort of instinct blindness, which is the idea that the things that seem obvious to us as humans, it often takes sort of going to a different culture or going to the zoo and looking at other animals to sort of see what's actually unique and weird and strange about us. And in reading your work, I think a lot about that in the sense of we are really strange in the extent to which we're cooperative and the relationships we have among our family and with our parents and even what childhood is like. So this is all sort of a long-winded way of saying, can you sort of lay out what is the mystery that you're interested in explaining and that I think for me at least, I didn't even realize was a mystery until I sort of read your work and saw your work on human life history and cooperation among generations.
Well, I think the mystery or the umbrella question that I've centered around is how there got to be so many of us. So we are this really odd life history conundrum where we have both increased over evolutionary time, millions of years, increased both investment in children, which we see in a change in survival rates, not so much of infants, but of juveniles, and also in reproduction. So, most animals specialize in either surviving or reproducing, and we did both. And so, how does that happen? And that is, my interest in cooperation, certainly, and how mothers solve the problem of having multiple dependents of different ages at the same time, which really, well, it's hard to ever say humans are unique in something because there's always an exception, but we are very unusual in that capacity, certainly of supporting 5, 6, 7, 8 dependents of different ages at the same time.
Yeah, and both David and I are parents. Mine's 5.5. David, I keep sorry, I'm sorry, three,
Three and a half,
two,
yeah.
3.5.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, 2 years apart. Yeah, and I think we really I certainly experience the software turning on of parenting, even for fathering. And just there's sort of a lot of we're very altricial, and there's a lot of investment necessary. Yes.
Right. And I guess when I was coming through graduate school, the explanations, I mean, you talked about how when people go to the field, yes, your socks get blown off and you really have to think about things in other ways. So when I went to the field, the expectation, and it's still something I've spent my career kind of trying to form a new narrative about the role of children. I think I still have a long ways to go in terms of convincing people, but the idea was that human children are these sort of little pariahs that just need, and suck, and all we can do is kind of they're this empty vessel that gets filled up, and that was the theoretic model that I had in mind. That was the analytic model that I had in mind when I went to the field for the first time. And and when you do go to the field for the first time, one of the things you do, because you can't just march into a community and start asking about reproduction and can I sit in your house and watch what you're doing all day long. You have to create a relationship, and you have to create loyalty and trust and et cetera. And so one way, at least we used to do it, is that, well, you would map your community, physically draw a map of your community, because you learn then where everyone's learning and where kinship relationships are. You can ask along the way age and sex of individuals living in different households. You get a sense of the community, and people love, well, one, they loved looking at maps and how you draw a map. And two, you collect, as I said, along the way, kind of the reproductive histories about what's going on. And one of the questions I asked, because I was interested basically in divisions of labor, was, do you spend any time in the fields? These were Maya agriculturalists, and most of their diet comes from corn, and an awful lot of their time supposedly would be spent in the fields. And I would ask men, women, and children this question, and it was always, women spend no time, children spend no time, and the dads all spent the time. And yet every morning I would get up, and in front of my little hut, there would walk by the women to the field, and tracing behind them were all the children walking behind in the field. And so one of my first eureka moments was that what people say and what people do are very different, which is why I guess I'm committed to observational sorts of research, because that deception was very clear to me right off the bat. So, my paradigm kind of really had to shift. And when I started analyzing my data, what I was observing and my hunches certainly manifested, and kids were doing an awful lot to support themselves and their siblings. And as I guess it's kind of evolved in my thinking over time, in the vernacular, I guess I would say all those kids are, in a sense, the very engine that supports high fertility. And it's a perpetuating, interactive, finely tuned piece of life history and economic machinery.
I'm very curious about that piece you mentioned that there was a disconnect between what people were saying and what people were doing. So why do you think that is? Why was there that disconnect between the narrative of how much time women and children spend in the fields and how much time they were actually spending in the fields? What do you think was behind that?
Well, I think in that case, there must be a strong norm that it's men are doing the work in the fields. And I mean,
Even if they're objectively not.
even if they're objectively not. I
Hmm.
mean, another good example is I had spent a day sitting in a house taking time allocation observations, and it was the end of the day, and there's a woman, she's got 8 kids, and she's tending the fire, and she's nursing a baby, And she says to me, it's getting dark. It's the end of the day. I've done my work for the day. Would you like to go home? And I knew she was heating up water to bathe her children, her 8 children. Well, she probably wasn't bathing the older ones, but the younger ones. She still had to feed them all. And yet from her point of view, she didn't consider that work. She knew I was there to record what people did in terms of productive sort of economic activities, but she didn't consider all of that childcare or mother's work or cooking to be work. So I guess, those are two kind of different examples. One is that, we just have different, it's difficult when you work I didn't probably speak Maya at that time. It's different when you're speaking through our common language of Spanish. It's, different when you're dealing with language. It's different when you're just dealing with how people perceive certain kinds of words, even.
Do you think this was just a linguistic misunderstanding, or was there a social reason that they felt the need to cover up how much they were working in the fields for, I don't know, some social or normative reason?
I think in the first case that I gave of why in an interview format, do you work in the field? That was probably for some kind of normative reason. I can't really explain why that would be. They're not a particularly machismo culture. Women are valued for their contributions, but it just was kind of remarkable and it's also the danger of just asking one simple question. I mean, the onus was probably on me for not parsing. I mean, I just was trying, as I say, that's how you kind of get entree into a community, is you sit down with families and talk to them as a way to humanize us all and make us, on friendly terms. And while I was going to study that, it wasn't my main objective. It was just to kind of talk to them. So anyway, right. I think that was, part of it was the onus is on me. If I'm going to rely on interview, my onus is on me to be able to parse the question in a way that you're going to get actually the answer that you want.
Yeah.
So part of it may be their norms about their own behavior, and part of it may be that I was just asking this one simple question to move on to all the other questions so that I could move on to my own research that I really wanted to do. Right.
It's funny. Yeah. And I mean, maybe this is the next question then, is sort of you have this thing where you're like, whoa, this is really different. Everyone's saying this one thing, but I go out and look and they're actually going in the fields. And now you mentioned that experience, and then you talked about earlier that you now have a very different view. Can you sort of walk us through how that experience now leads to this new view, where you talked about sort of this the engine of high fertility being children, and thinking about children in that lifespan, and thinking about them, as you're saying, as agents and having agency and not just being empty vessels. Can you kind of walk us through from that moment that you had that field experience to sort of what was the next step for you in your thinking, or how are you thinking now about that?
Well, so you're in the field for a year, you're collecting all these observations, you have hunches about, what you're seeing, repetitive patterns, and then you come back and you analyze your data. And it was very clear, the analysis was very clear. One difference is most of the arguments up until then were spurred mostly by demographers. And there was this whole cost of children literature and interest. So how much does a kid cost? And you can either sum the calories, or demographers sum the dollars. And then you look at what they put in, and, it doesn't match. Kids look really expensive, and they do. Maya kids, Pume kids, the hunters and gatherers that I work with in Venezuela, they look really expensive when you look at one kid. But my argument all along was humans have this really odd life history where we started, where mothers have multiple dependents of different ages. And so even as an economic question, we have to look at it not as one kid going through, but what does it look like as economically from the passel of kids going through? So any one kid, the 5-year-old, the 3-year-old, the 5-year-old are going to take out of the basket more than they put in, but the 12, 13, 15, 17-year-old are going to put more into the basket than they take out. And so you get, from the mother's point of view, she's just thinking about, how am I going to raise my kids? is, her calculus is not each kid is too expensive, but how can I manage the whole?
Right.
And that's one thing I really tried to bring to the analysis of how we think about kids, is thinking about this whole product moving forward as women decide to or not to have additional children.
Right. And what is it that, I mean, we are psychologists, but one of the reasons to have an integrated, evolutionary behavioral science is that anthropologists seeing, ways of living that are on the ground keep us lab psychologists honest. So what was it that you were seeing in terms of the expression of sort of care at different ages? Was the idea that sort of you're seeing that there's clearly evolved design in kids for taking care of siblings, or like kind of doing alloparenting as well? Or what was it that you were seeing?
Well, it changes. It certainly changes with age, but well, I guess some of the arguments that I've made is that kids have a low opportunity cost in terms of help. Uh, and so this is unlike other, humans. This is all in the kind of the rubric of cooperative breeding, but in other species, it's really not until the problem about cooperative breeding is why sexually mature individuals stick around home or the nest or the den or whatever longer after they can reproduce themselves, why they stick around longer and help raise their siblings.
Mm.
And the situation is very different for humans because, yes, by the time boys and girls are 16, 17, or 18, yes, you get to be that rub, and they do leave home. But it's those juveniles, like maybe even 3 to 12, 13, 14, who these aren't well, Maya then didn't have formal education. The Pume, the hunters and gatherers I work with, don't have any formal education. So in a sense, that is their school. That is how they're learning their adult skills, is by helping. And there's no real opportunity cost because they aren't looking around for mates and trying to start a family themselves. They're too young. So they're kind of a beholden audience, for that reason, that is their school, and they learn by doing. That's how they, I think that that's one place that anthropology and psychology really overlap, is in learning and like how we think about learning. There's several of us now that are like looking at learning in traditional societies, and it does seem to be very different in terms of learning from each other and learning while doing. And so again, just back to the idea that there's a low opportunity cost.
That's interesting that a lot of the childcare is being done by older kids who haven't yet left to go look for a mate or start a family, and a lot of that work is being done by these kids, and they're all learning by doing and working with each other. That's very different from the way things work in a modern society where kids aren't really playing that kind of teaching or pedagogical or child rearing
Right.
role. We farm that out to daycare or to formal education systems. Do you think that could be playing a role in why we see fertility levels being so low in Western cultures, and that kids literally are more expensive in Western cultures because they don't help each other the way they do in the communities you're studying? Do you think that might play a role?
Well, certainly that is one of the classic arguments for the demographic transition is about the cost of children. Those were very popular arguments in the 70s and 80s. And, I think we've tried to make it more nuanced, more sophisticated, but I think kind of economically it does come back to that you just, yes, that transition makes it, again, that engine breaks down. It doesn't, all those kids no longer really pay for themselves. I mean, in essence, what we see is in traditional societies, when you spin it out, kids are pretty much paying for themselves, that group of kids within a family. Right. And that's no longer the case. So that's certainly been, it's certainly a considerable, I think, part of why you get that demographic transition.
Yeah.
I think there's lots of other reasons now, and it's perpetuated for lots of other reasons now. But
What do you think some of those reasons are? I mean, we got into this briefly with Michael Gervin, sort of getting his take on what's going on with this drop in fertility that we see in the Western world as countries economically develop. You would think from a Darwinian perspective that greater prosperity would lead to greater
Right.
fertility, but what we see is the opposite. You mentioned one possible factor where in Western cultures, kids don't take care of themselves to the same extent that they do in other societies. So that might be one reason why fertility has gone down, is that they're just more expensive. What do you think are some of the other factors that you think are playing a key role here?
Well, this is not a place that I am an expert, is thinking about modern demographic transition. So there are many factors, and I think many different disciplines weigh in, both about cognitive, economic reasons that we just, talked about, cost of children. There certainly are, probably cultural evolution. The cultural evolutionists would have a set of explanations for that. I think psychologists would have an explanation for that. I think one obvious thing is when we've got 7 billion people on the planet. That's gone up many fold since, you and I were born, that it's just a super competitive world. And you have to, you have to think about, that aspect of it. I was going to say that demographers, well, to focus on a mean change, an average change in fertility is one question. But I guess what I've really learned watching this Maya community, the uptake of family planning or contraception, is something very different, that we have to really actually keep our eye on the variation and what's going on there. So in that Maya community, as in much of Mesoamerica and Latin America, family planning is introduced with tubal ligation. So this is, a real serious decision, on-off decision about whether you curtail your fertility or not. And it was, I trained as a demographer. I was looking at averages, and nothing was really changing. But I knew things were changing. I've worked in this community for 33 years. And so if you take a look at the variation, that's what was moving around, which was so interesting. So what parents were doing is, some were just, as life got more economically, as they started going through market integration, and there started to be some wealth. I wouldn't say there's even hardly wealth disparities yet, but no, that's coming down the track. Some people were putting that into somatic, reproductive efforts. Some people were having much larger families, and others were having smaller families. But you would miss all of that if you were looking at the average. You'd have to look at the distribution. And what was interesting is that women were, tubal ligation, again, really serious form of family planning. They were uptaking it at the end of their reproductive careers. So they would get a tubal ligation after they had 6 or 7 children. So it was curtailing them from having 7, 8, or 9 children, but they weren't yet making the decision, I just want to have 2 children or 1 child, until they understood the implications of this new world. So you've got this rapidly changing world economically. You've got these new market opportunities, and along with that comes the option to limit families size. And so what do you do? And what was so cool about that is that they had far more agency than we give most people, that they were making their own decisions, and they were basically making the most cautious decision they could. They were doing the new behavior. If you're following what I'm saying, they were doing the new behavior. They were uptaking family planning, but they were doing so at a time that really wouldn't have, late in their reproductive career, when it really wouldn't affect their fertility. Then 20 years later, when they start to understand the risks and opportunities, they start to then have those tubal ligations earlier in their reproductive career. So that's not super answering your question, because I'm looking at the demographic transition played out like literally in a 20-year period. Mm-hmm. And that's all I can say about that, is that women have, I guess, that parents make decisions, and they make conscious decisions about what they want to do, what they can afford to do. and how it might impact, if you only have 2 kids, you're not going to be growing crops much longer. You can't really afford to grow crops. So it's a pretty major decision. So I think those decisions, the demographic transition, we can see a mean change in family size, got much smaller, over a couple hundred years pretty quickly, I guess. But there's also a lot of variation around that.
Yeah.
And that's maybe where we can learn actually more about why parents make those decisions.
Yeah. What I'm hearing you say too is also, I think, from a very naive evolutionary perspective, and maybe one that, I'm certainly guilty of promulgating, would be one of there's evolved design for obviously like mating and for parenting, but the idea that sort of thinking about, well, how are my children going to succeed in this social ecology? And what can I do now to ensure their success in the future? Which, even if it wouldn't have included, birth control, or it might have over evolutionary time, but that's a little bit uncertain. I mean, we certainly have lots of cross-cultural ethnographic evidence of birth control and ways to sort of limit fertility. But to me, this sort of expresses a much richer psychology of sort of family planning, and even for the evolved psychology to sort of be aware of on the ground, what is the social landscape, what is the ecology, and how can I, as a parent, it's not like we're just, a species where we just sort of drop our eggs and say, good luck, everybody. Like we're really thinking about how can we smooth out the wrinkles? How should we invest? I mean, I realize it's not helicopter parenting like it may be in some places, but it seems to me to reflect still a design for thinking about being responsible and thinking about the consequences of sort of like what is the landscape that these children are going to be in, which is what I think you would expect. Do you think that's fair, or is that?
Well, I think all parents, think about that. I mean, even natural fertility parents who, there's other ways that you can alter your fertility than to take, birth
Right.
control or have a tubal ligation. And I think all parents think about what are the implications if I mean, I've certainly overheard those dialogues, those conversations, both among the Pune, among the Maya, certainly among friends and colleagues and students, that we think about the futures of our children and what's gonna do. I mean, there's a lot of built-in biological mechanisms in humans so that it's difficult. Well, there's few benefits and a lot of costs to have kids too closely together. So there are some limits that are just kind of imposed, so to speak, biologically. But I do think there's a well thought out conversations about that.
Yeah. David asked about the demographic transition. Are there other consequences, as you see it, to this idea that in a more quote unquote sort of natural ecology, children are having the experience of raising their siblings or close relatives or in multi-age cohorts, and we don't do that in certain
Right.
cultures, and ours. Are there other consequences, or what are those consequences, and what are the ones that you are thinking about or worrying about? Or yeah.
I think there are. I'm actually just starting to write a book on kind of the evolution of childhood.
Mm.
And while I'm again not an expert, because I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a developmental psychologist or a cognitive psychologist, but certainly I know I've got the other perspective of how kids organize themselves when they're children, versus what is very apparent in our own world. And that's one of the biggest, I think, aspects, is that kids in traditional societies hang out in mixed age groups. So there's very little, even, I'm not sure I think Mike was on that study, even among the Chamani, they looked at language learning, and they found there was incredibly low child-directed adult talk.
Mm.
Very low. And I found that not in terms of language, but just in terms of learning, that kids spend almost no time being taught by adults. Now, that's very culturally specific. I'm sure, in some cases, in some traditional cultures around the world, absolutely, there's hands-on parental teaching. I just don't observe it with the people that I work with. There's much more kids learning on their own. So for example, the Pume, the hunters and gatherers that I work with, a lot of their technology is woven technology, and little girls, so they use baskets of every shape and size to do, those are their containers, those are their bowls, those are how they carry things around. I mean, they're really, woven technology is really critical. They weave mats to sit on, so they don't have to sit on the dirt. And kids don't learn, how they learn to do that is not by mom showing them. They will they'll go to the garbage, the trash dump. They'll pick up a discarded basket or mat or something. They'll take it apart. I guess, lots of kids learn basic mechanics this way. They'll take it apart and they'll learn how to put it back together again.
Mm.
And, maybe when they're a little bit older, they'll ask, mom a question about something sophisticated, or the mother will correct them about something. But that's how they learn. They're not formally taught. And part of it, they're hanging out in mixed age and mixed sex groups, and they're learning an awful lot from each other. And I think there is probably a big price to pay for the fact that we have these age-regulated groupings, in terms of after-school sports, in terms of schooling, lots of expectation about age. And I think we've eliminated, I mean, at least what I'm writing so far about that. I certainly wouldn't recommend that we don't send our kids to school, but I think in terms of social learning, that's really critical, is that you learn from the older kids. You learn from the older kids how to socially regulate. And I think we miss out on that. I had a good example where a male, a postdoc, he brought down his kids to the field, and the Maya were so excited to see like what would it be, what the little ones would be like. And the kids were just kind of jaw-droppingly astonished that there was a 2-year-old, and the 2-year-old just threw fits, as our kids do, threw tantrums all the time. And they were just like dumbfounded, like how do you, like, why would you do that? And how do you get away with that? Or like sharing, it would be like they easily share. I mean, they're self-interested. There's no, essential difference. They easily share. And, it was like, that 2-year-old sort of behavior, that's mine and you can't have any. And yet the kid could recite their numbers and their letters in a way that the Maya kids could not. So there's just, there's real differences in terms of kind of cognitive skills and social skills. And, we need the cognitive skills, obviously, to succeed in our own world. But I worry about the social skills, I guess, and maybe what we're compromising.
Yeah. Do you think those social skills, I mean, and maybe I'm just saying the obvious inference is that the reason why the postdoc children got away with that was because there weren't just younger kids around who, when there was a fit, were just sort of like walked away. Because right, they're just not, they're not, they didn't buy into like, I'm gonna like go
Right.
the full way in dealing with a meltdown. I'm still a kid, and you know what, kid, have a meltdown, I'm not going to deal with this. And that just changes then the reward structure of the 2-year-old, of just
Right.
like, if I have a meltdown, doesn't do anything, I'm gonna, I'm just gonna do it less. Is that,
Right. Right. Yeah. Certainly there would be synergy for that. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
interesting.
I mean, I'm wondering if it has to do with the abstractness of the information that has to be transmitted in modern societies compared to foraging societies, and that a physical skill can easily be acquired by actually practicing it, actually doing it, being around other kids who are doing it, whereas learning how to read or write is not really the type of skill that you can learn by doing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of an alien way of learning that
Mm-hmm.
kids aren't really good at doing. I mean, the kids like to, move their bodies to manipulate things. They like to play around and experiment and, try things out and see what happens. That's much more the natural way that kids like to learn. But unfortunately, that's just not the way that you can learn how to read and write and do math. It's a very different mode of information. Do you think there's something about the nature of the information that needs to be learned to flourish in a modern society compared to a foraging society? Do you think that is one of the differences, perhaps, that leads to these cultural differences?
I mean, I think from the surface of it, it would seem like, the information that we need to learn is certainly additive, and adults have kind of the end game picture in mind, and so they can transmit that information. I mean, I would say, lots of technologies in traditional societies is pretty sophisticated. But I would say that's probably true. I'm not, like I'm saying, I wouldn't advocate that cognitive learning should perhaps, that's all very understandable, but I think it's just appreciating. I think what we always thought, what we tend to do is look at where we're at today and then kind of project backwards, as opposed to sort of thinking about, evolution happens from the past forward, and what some of those pressures and changes would have been. But just I mean, I guess just mostly appreciating that it's not a top down. We maybe aren't adapted to a top down process. It maybe is more challenging. Maybe that's why we have such trouble with retention, in schools and stuff like that. I don't have any idea. Those aren't things I really contemplate, but it could be that we are really well adapted into something different. But true, in this world, in this age, that's not what's going. We need these other skills to succeed.
Yeah, you use the word agency, and I think like one of the things I'm hearing is that there was sort of a lack of appreciation for many of the things you mentioned already of people having agency, including women, including children, who maybe were not appreciated for the agency they actually had, either in the evolutionary models or maybe by ethnographers in the past, or by scientists, or just by social world. Um, is that, can you speak a little bit to that? Is that a fair characterization? Do you think that that's one of the themes of the work that you've seen, is that it's sort of one way to be scientific is to sort of appreciate the agency of folks who have otherwise been sort of overlooked?
I think it certainly, in terms of kids, that's true. I mean, there are tons of books on child development and how to raise the best children that we can, and they really do always seem to be kind of top-down perspectives. One of the best a couple of examples of that are if you I'm sure any kind of research that you do, we have to go through all of these gyrations with human subjects to get approvals. And so the same thing is true when we go into the field. And I don't know, it was a number of years ago, and I had to get permission, in this case from adults, if a child could participate in something. And so I asked the mother, I said, could you sign this paper for your kid? And the kid was pretty little, probably 5 years old or so. And she just looked at me just kind of really quizzically and said, "Why are you asking me? Ask the kid."
Yeah.
It was just classic examples, like, I don't need to make this decision. If my child wants to participate, they'll make their own decision. Yeah. So I think that's really true in terms of why, kids have, I think really been under the radar in anthropology and archaeology. I also have a great story from Alison Brooks, who is a famous archaeologist working in sub-Saharan Africa, and she was living with like in a Kung, in a Juansi community, and every day, as a dutiful, mother from America. She made her kids peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and she'd go off to her excavation and give her kids the food. And she'd come back at the end of the day, and the lunch sack would still be full. And she would say, what were you, what were you doing all day long? And like, how did you eat? And it's like, oh yeah, we're out with the other kids. We're killing little birds, little lizards. We're eating this, we're grabbing that. And all of that, I think for decades and decades went completely unnoticed. They're just not watching what kids are doing, and because they're not bringing back, maybe the little ones aren't bringing back huge returns,
Right.
but they are actually really able, even among the Zhuangzi, who are, kids aren't known to really work that hard in that particular group of hunters and gatherers, were taking care of themselves, just going very unnoticed. So yes, I think they do have. I do think they have a lot of agency in their own society, and I think they do take care of themselves in ways that we just weren't paying attention to.
Yeah. And I don't want to get too sidetracked, but David, I just have a quick aside, which is, I also think like just institutionally, I think like there can also be institutional selection pressures of like, or even a fear of like kids' agency, right? Like, because it can be contrary to the goals of the adults, right? Or just if you don't appreciate what it is the kids are designed to do, status games, do things that are different than like, you're going to be working in the workshop, in 5 years, and you need to learn how to make a widget, and you better be a good worker, like that kind of thing.
Yeah, and then there's the issue of parent offspring conflict where parents have different genetic interests than their offspring, and often will want them to be more altruistic toward their siblings than the kids themselves would want to from a Darwinian perspective. And so there's the need to mold kids into a shape that is going to be more beneficial for the parents' fitness than for the offspring's fitness. And so you might expect, from the offspring's perspective, they are going to be better off learning from other kids in their peer group, whom they're going to be competing with as adults for status and for mates. That's going to be, a more important source of information for them than perhaps, being trying to be molded by their parents to fit the parents' agenda. I don't know if you buy any of that perspective in terms of parent offspring conflict, Karen, if that has informed your thinking on this at all.
Yes, I mean, certainly that's true. And you do see those conflicts, I guess, to the point I was making earlier about opportunity costs. Once those opportunity costs start to diminish when kids reach reproductive age, you certainly see those conflicts. You also see conflicts at the other end around weaning. I mean, I have seen 3-year-olds dump pots of boiling water on their 1-year-old sibling. I mean, you do see stuff, stuff happens where there's certainly conflict. And it's usually around weaning age, but then, I do think there's kind of a sweet spot where there's just a really low opportunity cost for kids to not, I mean, what else? They don't, like, if you see a Maya kid working in the field, they're, they'll weed a couple they'll weed for 5 minutes, and then they'll pick up some dirt clods and throw them at birds, and they'll, kind of wander off, and then they'll come back and they'll do their thing, and then they'll wander, that's, kind of kids are, you can't expect them. It's not like factory work for sure. And I don't think parents, what's one thing was interesting, both with the Pume and the Maya, you almost never hear the word no. You hear like the parents will tell kids, go do this, but they'll almost never, like a kid will be sitting right next to you, like singing a song at the top of their lungs, way off key, something that we would tell the kid to, like, could you just, cut it out? And they would just not, wouldn't, whatever. Kids could have a lot of freedom, except if they did need to do something, they would be told to do something. But you rarely heard, like, don't do that, don't do this, don't do this. And you realize, yes, we have to tell kids that all the time, because, there's the cleanser under the sink, there's the hot iron on the ironing board, there's the fertilizer that's on the grass. I mean, there's the street, there's the dog. I mean, there's so much that we have to guard kids against. And so anyway,
I mean, presumably though, there would be lots of things to guard against in a forager society. They're poisonous plants and
yes,
animals
right.
and bugs, and all sorts of dangers, fire and danger, sharp tools. There are lots of things that kids could get into in a
Right.
situation there too. So I'm curious about why that difference exists with the
Well, I think
more.
there's just so much more that's dangerous. I
You
mean,
think so? Okay.
absolutely. Kids don't, if they live around big carnivores, there are different rules. I haven't worked with people who live around big carnivores, but certainly I think adults are probably just as, freaked out by them as little kids are. But yeah, there certainly are things in place, but it just seems like in our houses, there's just a gazillion things that can, this is a change of magnitude
Mhm.
um,
Yeah.
in terms of the numbers of things that could potentially hurt us or hurt our kids.
Yeah. Do you detect any consequences of that freedom, like compared to, I mean, you cross these cultures. Are there differences in kids, like with freedom comes responsibility, sort of, is that, for example, or, are there notable differences? I mean, you talked about the 2-year-old having a fit, which was different for the people, for the other kids, in this other culture. Are there, in your thinking about transposing yourself between these different cultures, yeah, are there things that you've sort of noticed about kids? Like you mentioned, you're really thinking about, we're really missing something. Do you see those consequences? I mean, I even think about this, as a parent, even just small cultural differences, between like, living where my son grew up and where he lives now and what that effect has on me. I mean, have you thought about, what are the things that we might be blind to about ourselves or the children we're raising because they're not more responsible, or because we're not giving them as much freedom, or because we're not letting them grow up in a mixed age cohort like they might be designed to do?
Um, well, I mean, uh, I don't know how that quite would spin out, but I think if you know from a young age you have a lot of agency and you can make your own decisions. I don't know how that would affect, kind of adult decision making or maybe not so much adult, but juvenile, well, young adult decision making. We know all we hear, we just hear so much bad stuff with what's going on with young people, not so much children, but with young adults. I guess the other thing I would say, we live in such a rapidly changing world. It, it's just constantly, it's really in an exponential state of change. Whereas, I guess the people I'm talking about, there's some homeostasis to their way of life. I mean, the skills you learn as a kid are the skills that are going to be useful to you as an adult. I think it's important to really integrate society. I mean, I'm expecting, something I didn't set out to study, but the hunters and gatherers in Venezuela is such a broken down country. Their lives, probably, it's too dangerous for us to go back right now, but their lives have probably actually really not changed. Uh, but in with the Maya, their life has changed a lot, and you do see the break. I mean, you do see the beginnings of kind of breakdowns in terms of where kids spend their time, how they spend their time. It's not as integrated. The other thing is that kids and adults in more traditional societies, kids are kind of always there, like running. Adults are like doing something. Kids are just constantly like running in and out of adult spaces. And so there's a lot of sort of spatial integrity, whereas I think we have a lot of actually spatial segregation. And so I don't know what that means about long-term sort of respect or intergenerational integration. Um, I don't know. When I was a teen, I was embarrassed to be seen around my parents. You do anything to like not like drop me off like 2 blocks away and I'll
Yeah.
walk in, or whatever. I think that's changed back again. But that would just never cross a Pume or Maya child's mind to be embarrassed by their parent or their grandparent or
Mm.
Yeah, so it's hard to answer because I think there's so much flux and change happening right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a very thoughtful and careful answer. And I think even just being aware of the difference, right? To just even point to the fact that it is different and it is something to ask, right? I think that's a big part of it is just even asking the question. Yeah, and you would not even get to that question if you weren't sort of looking at the kinds of things that you're looking at, or more broadly taking kind of this evolutionary approach to life history. David, I think you were going to say something.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been talking a lot about life history. We've been throwing this word around a
Mm.
lot. I don't think it's something that we've ever delved into uh, thoroughly in this podcast before, and it's really a core perspective. It's a core approach to a lot of people in the evolutionary behavioral sciences. So I think it might be worth taking a moment to unpack, what life history means and what life history theory is and how that informs your work. So what is life history? What is life history theory to you, and how does that help you develop ideas in your research?
Okay, well, I think, it's a concept that came out of evolutionary biology, and it was a kind of a revolution at the time, to thinking about how we could think about species being different in terms of what were called R and K strategies. So, some species produce a lot of offspring and don't invest much in either one, and other ones produce a few offspring and invest a lot. That's kind of the short of it. And the idea is, once you make kind of a typology like that, there are going to be so many exceptions. So life history theory kind of, it didn't so much supplant it, but it gives it another way of looking at that. Life events are a differential time and energy investments are made in different life events. And there are differential fertility rates, mortality rates. So there's a focus on that, as well as on in growth and development, whether you have a short infancy or a long infancy, or weaned early or late, or reach sexual maturity early or late. So it's the idea that you have a unit of time, a unit of calories, a unit of energy, unit of money in our case, and you can allocate it to this thing or to that thing that's either going to aid in your survival or reproduction. And so then it's heavily reliant on the idea of a trade-off, that I can either do this thing or I can do that thing. So we can use that to think about, I think about many things about children, including growth and development. Why is it that we have the kind of pattern of growth and development that we do, and then also why we start to reproduce when we do or not. Do we curtail, in a sense, childhood and make that transition early, or do we make it later? And then kind of from the mother's point of view, also the children's point of view, this idea of how do you allocate your resources to different children in terms of fertility decisions, and how kids allocate their time in terms of either being helpful or not helpful. So I guess it informs that structure of time and energy and resources are limited and decisions are made about alternative choices is kind of what informs, I guess, most of what I do. Yes.
And I think just one thing because I think it's probably so baked in for you, but I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you were one of the people to really go and look at what people were doing and not just listen to sort of what people were saying, which is, you mentioned at the beginning, you actually are going on these follows, and it's sort of easy to say in a few seconds on a podcast, but that's a very difficult thing to do. I mean, can you talk a little bit about, like, well, how did you decide, or why did you decide to actually do that? And like, was that actually difficult? I mean, like that's,
Mhm.
I think for many people, my generation, even understanding sort of, because, we now that's sort of baked into, if you're going to do this, you have to go do a follow and actually track calories. But that was not, as I understand it, sort of a thing as much. I mean, I know people started to do that, but can you talk a little bit about like sort of what is that like doing? Or if you're somebody out listening who's never done that, like what does that involve? You know, like
Well, time allocation, scan observations, focal follows, all of that came out of studies with, I think, mostly with primates in the 60s and 70s. And the early behavioral ecologists, so I was a student of Hilly Kaplan's and Jane Lancaster's, and that's how they were trained by ethologists. They were actually trained here at the University of Utah. They were students of Kristen Hawkes,
mm,
and including Hilly Kaplan and Magdalena Hurtado. And they had a real emphasis on behavioral observation. Before I started studying with them in behavioral ecology, I was an archaeologist, and I was a student of Lou Binford's, who was kind of the father of the new archaeology, and his real emphasis was on bringing scientific thinking to archaeology, and on ethnoarchaeology, which is we have to see what people are doing. We can't see it in the archaeological record, so we have to go actually live and work with people that are living close to those ways of life. So all of that kind
mm,
of comes together, both from the archaeology, the ethnoarchaeology point of view, and then from the ethology point of view, and then as it translated into human behavioral ecology was behavioral observation.
right.
So that was kind of the stuff that we used. I mean, that was this when I was coming through. It was the stuff that we all did.
Yeah.
You collected your reproductive histories when you first went into the field, and then you collected your time allocation data, and it just has been abbreviated, I guess, over time. I can't talk any graduate students into doing it anymore. It's true.
Mm,
It's pretty labor intensive, and there are biases, but I would say it's by watching people over the course of a year. So usually a year time frame was the time frame. You would go from house to house, and every 15 minutes say write down what everyone was doing in that house. And after you have hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of observations, you can say 3 to 5 year olds spend this amount of their time doing this, rather than asking. I think it would also be really hard, maybe interview, maybe it's really limited because you can ask adults that, but I'm not sure about kids. And again, having parents say what kids are doing are probably really different than actually seeing them. So there was a real emphasis on it, and I think that is actually, it's reverted now more to interview, even among behavioral ecologists. Yeah, it's
mm,
much more interview oriented, and different questions have emerged, not so much how they spend their time, but I do think like knowing someone's age and sex, knowing what they do is pretty fundamental to so many questions that we want to ask.
yeah. I mean, and I don't, we can, but just the one question is sort of like, what does that do? I mean, when before you did that, and then after you didn't have that experience of being with a group of people and doing this sort of interesting and maybe slightly unnatural thing of every 15 minutes just noting down what people did.
Mhm.
For those of us who haven't done that, like, does that change how you think about people or how you observe, or what when you start doing that process, how does that change you as a person or scientist?
Well, I think it was the most magnificent way to have kind of come up at doing research. It did deeply change me as a human being. I think in a number of ways that maybe if you don't, sit there day after day after day in the boiling hot, and half the time you're really bored, but um, it is so human to understand that just watching what people do, it's not what they say they do, but we all love our children in the same way. We all are annoyed by the same things. We all feel certain ways. I mean, I think I go into the field every year. It's the most important thing, I think, to keep me as a kind, honest human being, is to understand that we're all connected in this we're all human. I mean, you can't walk out of that situation and be very prejudiced about people. I mean, it's even though there are hunters and gatherers, there's so much that we have in common. So yeah, I think there's a fundamental effect that it has on one's humanity for sure.
Mm.
And sense of empathy, that we're all up, kind of up against some of the same basic things. Yes.
Yeah, 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 and especially, I mean, just as a parent, especially, like I think even whenever I see another parent, whatever the social distance is, I sort of get a sliver of that. So I can't, it must be really life-changing to sort of experience that in lots of different ways, day to day,
Mm-hmm.
over a year. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the people are mostly good.
Yeah.
They're mostly really kind and really loving and really good. I mean, there's sometimes a few, bad eggs, and I think you deceive yourself as an anthropologist to think that, you are beloved like family. I mean, um, there's always you leave in the end, and so there's a difference. Yeah, I think it's a kind of a mistake to think that you are kind of one of them, but yeah, and it's a very different sense. Since you're asking the question, it's really different to miss a whole community. I can't even say what that's like because we don't really have that sense. Like when I'm not with them for a while, it's like I miss a village of 500. How do you even explain that? Like
Yeah.
we miss individuals, we miss, our kids, our parents, our friends, but like to miss a whole village
Yeah.
is like a different thing. But anyway, thanks for
Yeah.
asking. Mhm.
Yeah, it's sort of, I mean, I think a lot of the anthropologists we have on express that, and it's almost like you have this sort of strange alternate dimension. Not strange, but just it is an unusual thing as a human to sort of have this other life that you
Mhm.
miss. And
Mhm.
many people have expressed that. And yeah, and it's a wonderful thing. And I think it also ties to, and one of the things that David and I mentioned a lot on this podcast is sort of how, like you said, what we talk about may not always be representative of what we do. And it's nice that you're saying that in a way of sort of a lot of what we do is actually very universal and often very sort of just normal, everyday human stuff. And maybe not necessarily the stuff that makes the news, or all the horrible stuff, but just sort of beautifully mundane sort of stuff. Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean,
Mhm.
one of the mundane human things that our lives revolve around is parenthood itself, and the idea that there are two parents working together, the dad and the mom. And you've done some research on examining that question of, what is the natural sort of family structure. You have a paper with Ryan Schacht. The question is, are we monogamous? Is the title of the paper. And I'm curious how you would answer the question that you posed in the title of that paper. Do you see human life history as, in terms of biparental investment with a mother and a father, or is it more, is it different? Is it, are there different family structures that we have that we're perhaps more suited to? What do you think is the answer to the question of what is the most uh, natural or species typical parenting arrangement?
Well, that's a great question. I think there's been huge evolutionary changes in that. I mean, one of the things I have argued is, we can't see these behaviors in the past. So we have to work from phylogenetic studies. We have to work from what we know from closely related species. We have to work from what we know about living in these more traditional societies. I think we can say a couple of things. I do have a couple of papers on the cooperative economy of food and the evolution of the human family. That it is, well, one, the nuclear family is probably very novel. The idea of that you get a mom and a dad in a house. So at least in the past, we grew up in extended I think that's the minimum. You could say extended family households, and it's highly variable cross-culturally. Some places you get men's houses and you get women's houses. Other places you get a lot of, you get integrity between the two. So it's quite, it's quite variable. But I think what you can say is that the nuclear family is probably very, very recent, and in terms of hundreds of years. There's no question that, moms don't care who they get the help. I mean, I would say moms are agnostic, mothers are agnostic who they get the help from, whether or not it's their own kids, whether or not it's a partner, whether or not it's a grandparent. And I think probably the earliest systems were probably maternal structures where you get mothers and maybe related women and children. That it's a big evolutionary step to get male parental care in there. Mm-hmm. And it happens, of course it happens, but I would say it's one of the harder things to, there has to be some big social organizational changes. And that's what, I've explored this topic with some evolutionary biologists before that paper with Ryan about monogamy. And it is, I think what's interesting about it is, if you think of us as cooperative breeders, so what I mean by that is people other than mothers helping to raise offspring, very rare in the animal world, doesn't happen all that much, happens across a great diversity of species, but not that many species. And the evolutionary biologists usually argue that in order for that to have happened, there had to have been monogamy in the system at some point in the past. So there is a precedence for thinking that monogamy and cooperative breeding go together.
But why? Sorry, why? What's the evolutionary reasoning behind those links?
You would be, because they're trying to explain why sexually mature individuals would help a mother raise offspring that are not their own. So there's this high opportunity cost that we've talked about. And so if everyone is highly related, if you're more related in a community through monogamy, you're more likely to want to pay that opportunity cost. And I guess what I argue is that because if kids are that valuable to helping mothers, you don't necessarily, they may be half siblings, but they're not going to be any more distantly related than that. So you don't necessarily need that entry point of monogamy. In many other cooperative breeders, monogamy happens sometime, in the evolutionary past, and then the breeding system changed. Mm-hmm. So I guess to go back to your question, there is no question that male parental care is important in human societies. I think it's probably relatively, in terms of a big evolutionary picture, relatively late, because it requires a pretty big social organizational change that kids helping raise kids wouldn't require. And I don't think older individuals, I think older individuals, that's just demographically fairly not so probable.
What social organizational changes do you think need to be in place for male parental care to evolve?
There's this trade-off where you're going to have to assure paternity confidence. Women are going to have to, classic sexual selection. I guess you're going to have to, males will have to, Bernard Chappé has made a lot of arguments in this direction, which is kind of, how we dampen down male-male competition. Although I think you could argue, we don't bludgeon each other, but we certainly have other ways that males heavily compete with each other. But you'd have to dampen that. You'd have to respect your brother's children, your brother's wife, I guess. And so, oddly enough, we live in these communities where we have multiple breeding aged males and multiple breeding aged females. Just, a village, your neighbors. And we somehow dampen down the competition to, we respect those boundaries. Mm. And that's a big evolutionary change to what other great apes do. So we, probably go from a pretty polygynous past of some form, we don't really know, to one where we start respecting each other's boundaries. And I think that's pretty sophisticated.
Yeah. It was sort of, I
What
mean, we had Chris von Ruden on and he talked about Chris Bohm and sort of leveling mechanisms or coalitions. Is that sort of the thing you're referring? Like, I mean, that's the next step. I mean, it's all speculative. And of course, we're sort of on the edge here of sort of what the key topics. But I mean, is that sort of what you're uh, talking about too, where it would be just sort of, just from a very basic perspective, just sort of to the extent that we have a phenotype that allows us to be coalitional, then, we can sort of enforce norms like that, and that a belligerent, aggressive male might be teamed up against, and it's sort of a leveling mechanism in the Chris Bohm kind of way.
Yeah, but I mean that's a big step because other
Yeah,
primates don't do that. I
right.
mean, they form coalitions, certainly, but they also have no problem, taking on. There's no, yes, they're promiscuous.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think monogamy is pretty difficult to get to. Yeah.
Mm.
I mean, I know there's some new thinking on that, but I think the human story, whether or not we have a deep ancestry in that, that's what that paper, that's previous work that I've done with Andy Russell, looking at this question in other species of cooperative breeders. We have some of those traits, sort of, and we don't have others. So
Yeah.
biological traits, social traits. So I think I teach this a lot, and I just kind of let students. Know kind of what the evidence is on this side or that side, and they can make up their mind. I think it's a really loaded question. And there's other ways. We know in societies where there isn't a lot of paternity certainty, it's the uncles that play a big.
Yeah.
I think we do have to distinguish between male parental investment and paternal investment.
Right.
So you certainly can
what
have.
do you see? Oh, in terms of the father investing versus uncles or other men.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So where
Mhm.
Okay.
there's a lot of promiscuity, in those societies where there's a lot of promiscuity, it is mother's brother that will invest. Yeah.
Right. So a lot of facultative sort of in lingo, sort of a lot
Yeah.
of facultative design
Yeah.
here in terms of or not
Yeah.
parenting, but just investment in alloparenting and offspring and children. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good place for me to probably end, is that, I think the brilliance of the human strategy is our incredible flexibility.
Yeah.
And, we don't have just one breeding pattern. We've got all of these. I would say we're not committed male parental investors at all.
Right.
It is facultative, and we solve it in so many. That's why we're so successful at what we do. We solve these things in so many different ways.
Yeah. We
Yeah,
we have a
parenting.
mandatory question, which is there anything we should have asked you during this?
Oh,
Yeah.
I guess I mean I brought up some of them, but I guess I was thinking, okay, what are like one's eureka moments? What gets
Mm.
them to? And we did actually talk about a few of them, but
Yeah.
or
Yeah. Or how did you get, or maybe one question just sort of is like, how did you discover, how did you become an anthropologist or become interested in evolution?
Well, I was an archaeologist, and as I said, in ethnoarchaeology was really what was important at that time, was studying living hunters and gatherers, or recently ethnographic hunters and gatherers, and I just fell in love. I didn't have the patience for archaeology, really, the
Mm.
slowness of it. And I guess I would call myself, behavioral ecologist or an evolutionary anthropologist. And I guess I like thinking about origins questions, not historic narrative, not just explaining, why things are the way they are, but actually what the origins are, origin stories. And I also think it's a really good message for our time, because times are so sort of divisive, that it focuses in some ways on what makes us all human. And I think in psychology, there's even a greater emphasis on universals. I do think you do have to stay focused on variation in order to advance the science, but I do think it does pull together a lot about, what makes us fundamentally human. And I think that's a good message we need that message. Students need that message at this time.
Yeah. And I think even, one of the themes of this, in addition to sort of being aware of the agency of people who haven't, whose agency has sort of been overlooked, is also just that it offers this interesting, and I mean, your work is just, it highlights the uniqueness of what is our universal nature, right? That I think, if you don't take an evolutionary approach, you wouldn't even ask the question of, is monogamy what we're designed to do, or think, or even
Right.
ask questions about facultative male investment in children or things like that. And so I think seeing what we often take for granted, and seeing if it is weird or not, is a real value thing. And I think your work is a wonderful example of that. And it sounds like you're working on a book. Is that right?
I am. Yes.
Yeah. So we look forward to whenever that comes out.
Yes. Well, it's an experiment, because writing a popular book is something very different from writing an academic paper.
Right.
So yeah. Well, thank you for that. And and thank you for your podcast. It was really a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you so much for being on. We really appreciate it. And yeah, best of luck. And we look forward to having you on when the book is coming out. So so
I'll enjoy that. Okay.
yeah, I'm
All right.
sure.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Great pleasure
much.
talking to you all.
Yeah, you too. Thank you
Bye,
so much.
Dave and David. Bye.
David, how can people support the podcast now that we're all done with this episode?
Well, they can say that Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast, is awesome on social media. They can leave us a kind review, or they can visit us on Patreon and maybe throw us a few bucks, because more funding is always needed, as our friend Dan Sneezer would say. And also, just in general, reach out to us. Tell us what you think. Give us ideas. We're lovely to talk to, if I don't mind saying so.
Say so yourself. Yeah, I agree,
Yeah.
David. So yeah, and without further ado, here's going to be the next episode in a few moments or in a week. Enjoy.
Yep.